Hello, this video will talk you through Epping Forest. Epping Forest is a small-scale UK ecosystem that we use to help us illustrate all of the points on the spec. Namely, we use it to help us talk about interrelationships. We're going to have a quick look at food webs and food chains and a chat about nutrient cycling. So, like all case studies, we want to think about exactly where it's found. So, Epping Forest we find northeast of London. Okay. I'll jot that at the top just in case you forget. Okay, so the most important thing I would say about Epping Forest to note to start with is that most of our organisms here within the forest are what we call interdependent. Okay, I'll jot that key term here again. So if something is interdependent, it means it relies on something else. So for example, you might say you're interdependent with your parents. You rely on them for things like food and where you live. Okay, and the same sort of principles apply when we're talking about the forest. So the food web here looks something a little bit like this. So we can break down this food web almost into two sections. So we can say those at the bottom down here in this food web would be what we call the producers. So if we're talking about producers here, we might say, well, they're going to use photosynthesis and they're going to convert sunlight into chemical energy. So the producers here almost are providing the foundations for this food web and for the ecosystem. Our consumers then would be everything that we find above it, right the way to the top. Okay, so let's add in consumers here. So the consumers here are going to eat up or use all of the energy from lower down in the food web. So with our consumers, we might break them down a little bit more and say, well, some of these may well be what we call primary consumers. Some of these may be what we call secondary consumers. Okay, and it's a bit like saying, well, are you herbivore or carnivore? Okay, so primary consumers in this case would just eat things like plants. Okay, so if we have a little look at primary consumers, let's see if I can highlight those here. We might say, well, things like the rabbit, for example, would be a primary consumer. It's just going to eat the mosses or the grass. We might say, well, things like the mouse here in this case, that would be a primary consumer. If we have a little think about secondary, so our meat eaters, well, that might be things like the owl, who's likely to eat the mouse below it, or the fox. Okay, so the easy way to work that out in the exam would be to look at the arrows. The arrows in my food web here are showing me transfers of energy. Okay, so in this case it helps me to work out where the relationships are and therefore make those connections. So if we stick with having a little think about Epping Forest, there are a few key points we might want to note. So the first thing we'd want to say here is biodiversity is high. Okay, so if we're talking about biodiversity, we're saying, well, there are lots of different species of flora and fauna. Okay, the second thing we'd want to talk about here is we'd say, well, there's a process called nutrient cycling. Okay, and that nutrient cycling is something that enables this ecosystem to function particularly well. So we'll talk about exactly what we mean by that in a second. So if we go back to our original point here about biodiversity, we might say, well, what sort of key facts have we got to prove that this is a diverse ecosystem? So the first thing we would say is in this area alone, we've got 38 species of birds. So we know birds are something that exists because we've already had a little look at our food web. They've got about 700 species of fungi. So you think things like mushrooms, for example. And then last but not least, we would say, well, there's quite a wide range of trees. So in particular, we find lots of oak, elm, ash and beech trees here. All of which help to provide sort of the foundations, if you like, for this ecosystem. And we'll talk about exactly why now when we have a little chat about nutrient cycling. Okay, so nutrient cycling again promotes this idea of interdependence because all of the things within the nutrient cycle rely on each other. So the easiest point I think to start when we talk about nutrient cycle is to start at the top with biomass. So biomass is something we know is really high in Epping Forest. Okay, they've got lots and lots of trees, therefore we would expect to see lots and lots of biomass. So we could draw in here a little picture of a tree. This is something I would encourage you to do in the exam if you're struggling to explain it. So let's have a little think. Okay, so I've got my tree first and foremost. So about every autumn then, we know our trees are going to shred leaves in order to conserve energy. Okay, so my tree would shred its leaves here at this point. Okay, and that's what we call littering. I then have, at the litter section of my diagram here, lots and lots of leaves on the floor. Okay, and at that point my leaves would mulch down, they would decompose, and that would make really, really nice fertile conditions in my soil. Well, for my tree to grow again, it would take up all of the nutrients from the soil, and that's going to help it blossom into that lovely tree I drew right at the start. So this cycle is something that we see happening over and over again. If we were to break an element of this cycle, for example, remove the trees from the area, well then we wouldn't have litter, and the soil conditions, you might argue, might not be quite as good. So each of these three things that we see here are reliant on each other. With this nutrient cycle comes inputs and outputs. Okay, so our inputs here I've drawn on in green. So rainfall is one input we see particularly at the litter stage of things, which is going to support with the decomposing. Our weathering of rock here again supports the conditions in our soil. So the red arrows I've got here, well, if the green is inputs, then our red here are outputs. So things like surface runoff, so if I have too much rainfall, I'm going to lose some of that surface water. And the same with our soil here. I can see a leaching, which is loss of nutrients, okay, through things like, for example, heavy rainfall. But ultimately, each of these 3 points continue to cycle round, okay? And with these 3 things cycling round, and again with our biomass and our litter and our soil interdependent on each other, well, that supports the ecosystem that we talked about right at the start. Okay, so without that nutrient cycle, we might say, well, in particular, it's not going to support the growth here, is it, of things like our primary consumers and our producers, and it would threaten the biodiversity that we have within that ecosystem. So I hope this helps you to recap Epping Forest, and as ever, if you've got any questions, go and ask your geography teacher.